Hello everyone, this is TheSodorSamuari back again with a very special video. A video covering my top 20 favorite Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends episodes of all time, in celebration of 40 years of the TV series when Britt Allcroft successfully adapted and brought the Reverend Audrey's Railway Series books to life on our screens. I have always wanted to do a video like that, similar to those like Thomas 1 Edward 2 Henry 3, Unlucky Tug, Yami Tay, etc. However, it was so complicated to try and get it complete that I lost motivation to do it. But now, with much courage to try and complete it for this very special occasion, here it is. But before we begin, I would like to clarify a few things. 1. The following video is pure opinion. If there's an episode from this list that I love, but no one else likes, that's perfectly fine. And speaking of which, 2. This is only just a top 20 favorite episodes, so please do not consider this as top 20 best, because we all have other personal picks for what we like. Number 3. This video does contain foul language, slightly, so again, this is not made for kids. It's for older fans and adults who enjoy the older seasons for nostalgia purposes. And finally, no episodes from All Engines Go reboot will be included on this list, as most of my favorites are from and only the original canon from series 1 to 24. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy my top 20 favorite Thomas episodes. Number 20. Gordon and Rebecca coming through. Yes, I can already hear everyone saying, "What? A Big World Big Adventures episode in your top 20 list?" Yes, but before any of you people start commenting, let me say this. I know most of you don't like Bwubba, and admittedly neither do I as well after my latest rewatch. However, there are a few hidden good things that came right out from that era. A small amount. Again, depends on our own opinions, of course. Aside from the Michael White episodes, I really enjoyed the Rebecca episodes, since she is my favorite female engine and CGI character overall. However, like many others, I do wish she was part of the original show had her introduction from Series 21 not been pushed forward to the Bwubba era. But moving back to the episode, like some others, I am a sucker for the Gordon and Rebecca close friendship, even though they are work colleagues turned friends in my series, Great Soda Engines, while she and Bear are the true best friends. And this episode really shows the relationship between my two favorite characters really well. Gordon is in his proper character first off, after 2 seasons of torture, and I like how he acts as a mentor figure towards Rebecca on how to pull the express. And as for Rebecca, she is so adorable in this too, with her naiveness on full display too. While the plot is what I can call as good as Gordon done right, but it also reminded me of a Liv and Maddie episode, but more of in the final season of said show. As for the other good moments, I did chuckle at James's remark about Gordon and the lather retorting back at him from a far distance, and I really loved the camera shots during the near miss scene. While Jam-filled Toronto isn't as good as Arc beforehand, and their animation Bwubba looks awkward nowadays, but I can't deny that their overhead shots are, if not really good. And while yeah, the ending could have been a little more tweaked, I still overall love this episode, and definitely not just another favorite Gordon episode of mine, but also my favorite Rebecca episode that earns a soft spot on this list. Number 19. Rusty to the Rescue. This episode is one of the most controversial episodes of the fan base. Some love it while others hated it, and for obvious reasons given how Stepney's origins were changed in the TV series. But as for me, I enjoy it, and it's another one of those guilty pleasure episodes for me, you could say. Yeah, they could have adapted Bluebells of England, but when you think about it, it is kinda short as a story in the Railway series to fit the 4-minute slot, and imagine the amount of budget they had to endure of building more new engines and props that would have also been very costly to appear in just 1 or 2 scenes, and that's it. And also, I think the TV series really did a much better job at making Rusty a much more prominent character of the narrow gauge fleet, something that the Reverend W. Audrey never done anything with him, so I gotta give props to both Britt Allcroft and David Mitton in doing so, as well as establishing Stepney's character as well. Now for the production side of things, holy godred, that scrapyard scene end yard, which is a redressed Croven's Gate set, looks so hauntingly amazing. This really gives the illusion of real-life influences brought into the series that never plays down to kids and feels more reality too. I also like how they position the existing Diesel characters in different places to also give the audiences the illusion that these are different engines. But my absolute favorite scene of the episode is with the shot of Rusty and Stepney going over the mainland viaduct with that big moon in the background. Holy crap, does that look so gorgeous! Music-wise, Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell really did a spectacular job with this episode, including the rescue scene. It just feels like something out of a prison breakthrough movie. And lastly, props to both George Carlin and Michael Angelis for their remarkable narration, including Angelis' narration during the shot of the Diesels. Overall, while it may be controversial as stated, but Rusty to the Rescue is another fine masterpiece in modeling. Number 18. James and the Trouble with Trees. I have so much fond memories of this episode, even though this is one of those very times where I used to get scared by it too in childhood, most notably the different close-up scenes of James's shock face in the climax. Anyway, this episode feels like it's stripped out from the Railway series. To those that don't know, it is directly based on a real-life incident where a tree slid down a slope while standing upright in the middle of the line, with a 72 XX tank engine struggling to reverse its heavy train away from it, which is exactly what happens to James. The amount of realism and effort put into this, as well as the rest of Season 5, shows how much care and dedication Britt Allcroft and David Mitton put into, as well as respecting the true aspect of Wilbert Audrey's stories based on real events, hence why they hired David Maidman as railway consultant, since he actually used to be a former railwayman himself. You could say Season 5 may be a full non-Audrey season, but its dialogue and stories makes it feel like Audrey's vision. Moving on to the rest of the episode, I love the dynamic between Thomas and James, two characters which you never see interact in the books, but when they're together in many starring roles, they bounce off each other pretty well while also getting on each other's throats, though it's mostly James who ignites the rivalry. However, I'd say Thomas is at his very best in Season 5, coming such a long way from when he was first introduced. Despite being teased or looked down at by the big engines, he'd still go out of his way to help them in times of need. I really wish the remainder of the show stuck to that personality. The scene where he decides not to tease James shows how much he's grown as a character given the dangerous situation. The other characters are all very well portrayed here, especially Henry and James's banter over the pettiest of things. The model work is spectacular too, including the weathering on Thomas at the beginning and the stormy atmosphere, especially during the tree scene. That particular set looks so real and lifelike. Even those rush tapes of how they filmed this scene is quite something. I also love Alec Baldwin's narration too, especially his James voice. And while I don't like the UK version of Season 5, Michael Angelis does have a few hidden gems of line deliveries in a few places, even in his James voice. Now for my history with this episode, back in my childhood, after I lost the VHS tape of Make Someone Happy and before getting the DVD copy that I still have, I remember watching this episode all the time via my take-along DVD sample of said episode that came with the set of James and the Tree, along with Special Letter and Plunge. Man, those were the days of our lives. Yes, reference to that one song by Queen, right? Overall, this is a well-structured episode that has that unique Audrey style of writing. Number 17. Escape. There have been tons of fans talking about this episode that I just can't put it in my own words to describe my thoughts on it, so I'm gonna try as best as I could. When I first saw this episode a few times as a kid, I didn't really think too much about it, other than a few scares from Douglas now and then. I guess it's mostly due to the fact it was featured on one VHS/DVD release in the US. I mean, most fans in the UK and other countries are probably lucky enough to see it on several releases it was featured on. But as I got older, I understand why it is such a fan favorite story. First off is the iconic escape theme. It's so epic and orchestrated that, like Rusty to the Rescue, it sounds like it is taken straight out of a movie. Second is Oliver, who has such a very interesting backstory as well as his character. He has become such a fan favorite among people because of this episode. I especially love the condition made to him when he was first seen before being restored with rust and dirt all over him, something that was not featured in the original Railway series story. It really makes you realize he's in desperation to get away from a similar fate as Type are facing. And as for Douglas, his character arc really comes full circle because before, he used to be in the same position as well, having nearly almost being scrapped himself. Even the word used by Edward unnerved him when he told him the similarities between him and Trevor. But when he sees Oliver, he uses Edward's words as inspiration and does the honorable thing by rescuing him and towed to Sodor. Also, like Rusty to the Rescue, I like how they position the existing Diesel characters and portray them as other members. Not much else to say, other than it's an awesome episode that gives you bone chills, yet satisfaction for the salvation of preserving steam locomotives. Number 16. A Bad Day for Sir Handel. For some odd reason, I don't see any Thomas fan recall this episode as one of their favorites. Other times I often see a few reviews by other users claiming it is the worst episode of Series 4 because it was not faithfully adapted in the way it was told. In my opinion, it was the fault of production order that caused it since Four Little Engines came first, and then this and Refreshment Lady were shown later despite Skarloey being sent away to be mended. So when you switch those episodes around by having this as number 5, Refreshment Lady is 6, and finally Four Little Engines is number 7, it wouldn't be too bad. But back to the episode on its own, I remember watching this on my Rusty to the Rescue VHS as a kid way before I got a copy of said release several years later when I lost it, and back then, Sir Handel was one of my favorite narrow gauge characters. It really confuses me of why he didn't appear in Series 5 to 9 before he was brought back again, cause he is such a fun character. That wasn't until I learned that they couldn't afford the budget to build a large-scale model for him in Season 5 until the hit era. Guess that's why he and Duke never reappeared again. Then one day, I remember watching Series 4 on YouTube, and that is what introduced me to the UK narration of the show. Prior, I used to watch New Friends for Thomas VHS, which was my first exposure to Michael Angelus's narrations. I thought he was fine, but didn't know who he was back then until this episode when I realized he was the narrator for the UK version. And to be honest, he's actually very good, especially in Season 4 being one of his best narrated seasons in my opinion. Still, even George Carlin did a great job too, but I think Michael carried that episode extremely well. As for the sets, I really love the mountainous and forested areas of the Skarloey Railway. It looks so lifelike, just like its real twin counterpart, the Tallyland Railway. I really love the shot of Skarloey going over the mountain with that mist rising from the bottom. Even the music is spectacular as well, as the Skarloey Railway theme is one of my favorite pieces from Mike and Jr. As for the other stuff, I find Sir Handel and Gordon's conversation extremely humorous, especially when the former said they needed to chat but says they has to keep time leaving Gordon agape is all too rich. Even the banter he had with Peter, Sam and the coaches is really written well too. While it may not be faithfully adapted, but on its own, it's still a favorite Sir Handel episode of mine, as well as my second favorite of Series 4. Number 15. Gordon and Spencer. Ah, yes, this is a fan-favorite Series 7 episode among many longtime Thomas fans and train nerds, especially me, for a number of reasons. One, for it kick-started one of the greatest rivalries in the show, and that being two of my favorite Gresley characters, and especially, of course, the London Northeastern Railway's my favorite pre-British railway company of the Big Four. I'll talk about Spencer first. He is one of my absolute favorite non-Audrey Thomas characters from the classic series that feels like a lost character from the Railway series. But what I love most about him is that he represents a mirror reflection to Gordon, especially given his real-life counterpart. The LNER Gresley A4s are my favorite steam engine class and are also upgraded versions of Gordon's class, the A3s. I even found out later when watching one of the recent Flying Scotsman documentaries that the A4s superseded the popularity away from the A3s, including Flying Scotsman when they were first introduced, hence the rivalry, so it makes a lot of sense. Speaking of Gordon, I really love how he came out on top in this episode. He started out as pompous as usual, but later when Spencer arrives on the scene, he starts to become more humble and sympathetic that you just gotta feel sorry for him, even when his own cousin ignored his advice. But even after being shown up, he is still willing to come to the rescue, and in the end, he is still Sodor's fastest engine. That really feels like Gordon's swan song in the entire classic series, and for good reasons too. I have read in Lee Pressman's interview that he was pressured by the hit entertainment crew to make changes to the episode's script, and afterwards he was never asked to write for Thomas again until Series 17. I may not like the idea of individual writers from different shows to work on Thomas, as I mostly prefer key writers, but even those kinds of weird stuff wasn't even their fault given studio mandates, so it makes me wonder what his original idea was for the episode. It was also the first episode on the New Friends for Thomas VHS, so whenever I pop it in, it is always a treat to watch. Gordon and Spencer is truly an iconic episode that not only just starts as a brilliant episode, but is also fantastic writing that derives from real railway history perfectly. Number 14. The Refreshment Ladies' Tea Shop. Yep, another favorite Season 7 episode is on this list, and it should come as no surprise that Peter Sam is now my favorite narrow gauge engine, tied with Rheneas. Of course, he is another fan favorite by many other Thomas fans for that particular reason, especially after watching Thomas Theorist's video about him. On to the episode itself. I love how it's a sequel to Peter Sam and the Refreshment Lady all the way back in Series 4. But what makes it even more unique is Peter Sam's willingness to help the Refreshment Lady find a new tea shop, but the latter was having trouble figuring out which place she would build at. Then later, he comes up with the unique idea of turning an old coach into a mobile tea room on wheels, which, fun fact, is also inspired by an actual tea coach on the Talyllyn Railway, so that makes the concept even more special. But what I love most about the episode is the scenery. While nothing would top the sets in Season 4, but in a few episodes, the locations actually look more prettier. I mean, some even feel more British-esque as well. I guess it's mostly due to the lighting being more vibrant. Seriously, just look at that rainbow at the causeway and the mist in the background. It looks so real and whimsical. While I may enjoy some episodes with crashes in action, it's always nice to have a slice of life stories because that's all what Thomas is all about, and there's no need for a crash to drive the story further to make it better. Even the narration by Michael Angelis is so soothing to listen to, and even the music by Mikan Jr. is so calming and excellent. Michael Brandon's narration isn't bad either, though I think it would fit better with the original music. Like the previous episode, it does feel like a story that belongs in the Railway series with that Audrey-esque charm. Most people tend to claim Special Funnel as their favorite episode about Peter Sam, and while this is a brilliant episode too, it just couldn't top this one. The Refreshment Ladies' Tea Shop is definitely what I can call a delightful piece of cake. Number 13. Ghost Train and Last Train for Christmas. Okay, this might not be a two-parter, but I really can't choose which one I prefer, which I'll go over each. But reason why I like them both is that they are each the mascot episodes to watch around different holidays. I'll start off with Ghost Train. It's no secret why the fandom loves this episode. It's hauntingly spooktacular, no pun intended. And it's so popular too, not only because it was just featured on many different home media releases in the UK, US, and other countries, and not just being one of Percy's finest episodes, but because it is also the first supernatural themed episode long before season 5. I remember being so scared by this episode, well, aside from maybe Thomas and Toby's shock faces, but the shot of Percy before hitting the cart of lime always feel frightening and tense for me as a kid. And then there's the iconic Ghost Train theme, which is perhaps one of the most scariest themes of all time, especially that shot at the beginning. And the main goal of this episode are the sets. The way they dressed them up with all that fog and bare trees made it look like you're in a different environment full of things that are about to go bump in the night. And in terms of narration, both Ringo and George Carlin did a fantastic job with this, again no pun intended, including the echoey effect where Percy spooks Thomas. And now for Last Train for Christmas. While other fans have so much to say about it in other videos, but to sum it all up in the best way I could, this represents the true meaning of Christmas, which is not all about parties and stuff, or that stereotypical Hallmark feeling, but it's about being together with family and friends, giving all your best efforts to help those in need, etc. And that also captures the true aspect of the Northwestern Railway, or the Sodor Railway as it's originally called, which is of course, serving the community. Especially because on a real railway, even at Christmas time, everything is packed and everyone has to give it their all to get them home in time for Christmas, even when all odds are against them. And that's exactly what Thomas and his friends did. Instead of giving up, they pressed on to help Connor and the remaining passengers home. That alone also reminded me of Thomas and Percy's Christmas adventure and Toby Had a Little Lamb. Also, I find it so funny how the engines keep mistaking Harold for Santa Claus during the operation. Even the visuals in this episode are just eye candy, especially with Connor traveling through the snowy night. And the music, oh god, Robert Hartshorn has such uplifting music that fits the episode so well. What else to say overall? Brilliant episodes, awesome visuals. They are both my favorites to watch around Halloween and Christmas each. Number 12. Troublesome Trucks. I have so many fond memories of watching this episode in childhood, especially off of my James Learns a Lesson VHS and DVD releases. However, I don't see that many people talk about it that much. As much as I think so, given that they sometimes believe the first half of Series 1's events just sort of happen and not a lot of action. As for me, I love how it continues James's character arc from where it left off in James and the Coaches. He had a lot of trials and tribulations at first, but was then given a second chance by pulling a goods train. I also love his determination this episode. From the first time we saw him in Breakdown Train, he used to have trouble with trucks that made him have an accident. But here, he does not try to let them beat him, and despite losing half of his train on Gordon's Hill and Edward asking if he could bank him up, he isn't willing to give up and actually tries again. That is true character development. It makes you so satisfied for him after he successfully pulled the trucks over the top of Gordon's Hill in fine style. And his main reward in the end is being allowed to keep his red paint job. I also really love his triumphant theme, which gives it that sense of willpower and determination. One thing I really appreciate is how the crew added some tears to give more life to the beginning scene when we see James feeling sad. This is something we don't see very often in the show, at least in most episodes. Even Ringo Starr nailed that scene pretty well. George Carlin's is alright, but not enough somberness in his performance, sadly. I feel that James's character arc in Season 1 is often overlooked by many people, especially given that there are far more greater episodes of him such as Buzz Buzz, Trouble with Trees, Second Best, etc., some even claiming it to be a mirrored version of Thomas's arc from the very beginning. Heck, even Wilbert Awdry states that the James book was his least favorite out of the Railway series as he was rushed to meet a deadline originally. But to be honest though, even if it may be a little similar, it doesn't ruin the episodes for me, because when you look past them, those can actually be very good episodes on their own. And I wholeheartedly think that Troublesome Trucks is a really splendid episode that defines James in a very positive way. Number 11. Gordon and the Engineer. Yep, a hit era episode is on this list. While this may be a turbulent point for the franchise since the buyout in 2002, it doesn't essentially mean that there are some hidden gems sprinkled throughout it, at least in several episodes that are generally good, and Gordon and the Engineer is definitely one of them. What I love most about the episode is how its structure plays out. If you were to ask a person why they love the show, one of the main aspects they'll tell you is because of how realistic it is. Not many people would often know how an actual railway works in Thomas like in real life, and this is apparent here. The points on the main line were broken and all the engines couldn't continue their work until they are fixed, with Gordon being allowed through because he is on his way to collect the mechanic to mend them, or engineer in the UK dub, even if he accidentally collected a carpenter by mistake. That is something of how it can happen on a regular basis if railway technology sometimes malfunction like signals or points, and as a result, trains are delayed because of them until they can be sorted out. I also really like how Gordon's character is played, and I think it's no secret that out of all the characters, Gordon, James, and Duncan are the most consistent characters in the hit era to maintain their classic series personas. And this is also the case for other episodes like Squeak, Rattle, and Roll, Gordon Takes Charge, Respect for Gordon and It's Good to Be Gordon, and if you count the Nitrogen era, yeah, that too. It's only a shame that good-hearted side of Gordon is thrown out the window during the Brenner and Bwaba eras. It's these moments like this that made me want to watch these over and over again for my favorite character. And in this episode, after he realizes his mistake, he agrees to go on Thomas's line to pick him up, only to run into the Scottish twins on his way, but instead of moping around, he comes up with the idea to have the engines all work together to get the railway back up and running again. And speaking of Donald and Douglas, it's so cool to see the Caledonian twins return and speak in this episode. Even if most of the other characters were sidelined into obscurity for the main characters and newbies, once in a while they do pop up now and then, so that not all of Sodor feels empty, no matter if the episode is good or bad. And one last thing I want to bring up, fun fact, the season it was featured in, along with Season 10, are both the first seasons I ever watched after I discovered YouTube some years ago. I didn't get a chance of watching it on TV or home media, so I had no idea of their existence at the time, so this site was the only option to see them. Not to mention nearly all the episodes from both seasons ever made it to DVD in the US, which makes it kinda strange and harder to find. Overall though, this is a great gem of an episode that I can easily rewatch whenever desired. Number 10. Brakevan and the Deputation. Now this is a two-parter that can easily be tied cause you can't complete an arc without the other. Both of these episodes hold many childhood memories for me. However, they were one of the few episodes that I watched like 2 to 3 times as a kid. Brakevan was released twice on 2 VHS tapes, but Deputation had 1, and that was it. Over time, I did finally saw these two again when I first discovered YouTube, and I fell hands over heels with these two, both Ringo Starr and George Carlin dubs. This also introduces 2 of my favorite twin characters, Donald and Douglas, and it was through these 2 that I eventually learned more about Scotland growing up. Though if you were to ask me who is my favorite of the twin duo, then my answer is Douglas because of his arc of nearly being scrapped, and likely would have been if he were sent back, which of course led to him rescuing Oliver and conquering his fears and escape, and also because 10 is my favorite number. Breakvan had a lot of cool crashes due to how crazy and destructive both of them were, from Donald smashing a signal box to Douglas breaking up the Breakvan, no pun intended. Both of these really stood out, even in childhood. The deputation also shows them at their finest clearing the snow, and in return, all the engines band together to stand up to the Fat Controller and allow the twins to stay. Honestly, I wish this episode was nominated for a BAFTA award instead of that stupid Rainbow episode with a blatantly said moral. It shows how much the original classic era handled its life lessons with hidden intelligence that brings something out of the child growing up, which is something George Carlin always praised about during his time as narrator. And speaking of whom, I really love his narration for both episodes. Of course, I also like Ringo's too in the UK dub, but there is something about George's narration that really shines, in Deputation especially. Even before Michael Brandon, he provided his own improvs and humor to the episode which is not present to the UK narration, such as Henry shouting for help or Percy stuttering during his desperation talk with the Fat Controller. But what I loved best of all were his voices for Donald and Douglas, nailing their Scottish heritage pretty well, and those are my absolute favorite voices by him. Would have been even more hilarious if he used those said voices for his stand-up dirty words, even though I don't necessarily watch them. Overall, those are my favorite episodes to come out of Series 2, and if there's one thing to learn, never mess with a pair of Caledonian twins. Try to mess with them and they'll give you payback in a more unexpected twist. Number 9. Thomas and Gordon. Oh, come on! You really think it's no surprise that I put the very first episode that started the show on this list? Most people go forth with other better Thomas-centric episodes like Jet Engine, Three Cheers, Royal Engine, etc. But this one is really special to me because of many childhood memories. I always had that VHS it was featured on, that being its American title, Thomas Gets Tricked. And as a kid, I always have fond memories of Ringo Starr's narration. No, I don't associate through his music fame, but it is mostly through the tone of his voice growing up. He narrates the first 2 seasons really well, as if he was a father reading a bedtime story to his children at home, which is what makes him my favorite narrator. And I can see why Britt Allcroft chose him to narrate the show, because of the soothing tone that children can relate. The first few tapes I had in childhood were all of his narrations. And no offense to anyone, but I was never really a fan of George Carlin's re-narrations. I do now with time, for some anyway, but back then I mostly prefer Ringo. Back to the episode itself, this classifies the true example of what Thomas and Gordon are as characters when first introduced. They always get on each other's nerves before the events of Down the Mine when they finally became friends at last. Usually it was Thomas though who ignited the flame, with him being big-headed and cocky back then, believing he works harder than any other engine. So what did Gordon do? He simply put him in his place by dragging him across the whole island with the express, and thus Thomas was quick to learn never to mess around with the big blue engine. While the Adventure Begins version is good, it kinda misses the point where it's only Thomas startling Gordon once, and then when we get to the events of said story, it didn't really feel grounded and just had Gordon dragging Thomas for no reason that is only once and not multiple times, even if this was my favorite scene from the movie. Also, I really love Gordon's theme in this episode. It's so upbeat and has a faster feel to it. Even the shots in this episode are some of the best to come out from it. Even that ending shot of Thomas going over the viaduct during sunset looks so gorgeous, even predating the season 3 to 5 ones. Overall, this is not only my favorite Thomas-centered episode, but also a brilliant way to kick off this iconic, brilliant show that we know and love growing up, which we still do today. Number 8. The Flying Kipper. It's pretty obvious that this other fan favorite was going to be on the list, and there are a lot of other people that talk highly of this episode, but I'll try to share my own thoughts exactly. This is not only one of Henry's most finest episodes to come out from the show, but also the most visually to come out from Series 1. This is the very first episode to take place fully at night, and my god, those shots look absolutely stunning, at least in the original version. The silhouette of Henry traveling through the snowy countryside against the early dawn looks so beautiful and real, along with the kick-ass Flying Kipper theme, which is what always stuck out to us fans to this very day. Even the shot at the end where Henry returned from crew over the viaduct looks something out of a painting. But what makes this episode even more unique was, you guessed it, the very first on-screen crash. Truth be told, in childhood, this used to scare me a lot, and I know I'm not the only one who feels that way too. But with time, I really managed to overcome my fear, and now it's become one of my favorite crashes from the show. It's tense, it's brutal, and it's frightening to see a big engine smashing into another train with debris flying all around before falling onto its side. I'm honestly glad that Britt Allcroft and David Midden removed that unnecessary Coco part from the original story to instead give a moment of silence for the audience to take in before it fades to daylight to see the aftermath of Henry's accident, especially given that this is directly based on the Abbott Ripton's crash of 1876. In fact, this is one of those few times where the adaptation is better than the original story in the Railway series. From what I understand, this would have been what was originally going to be Audrey writing out Henry from the series due to difficulty with artists when writing the series, but because of children writing on how much they wanted to see more of him, he actually retooled the character from a troublesome design to an enterprising engine that we know and love today. If you check my Reality of Thomas essay video, you'll know what I mean. Finally, both Ringo Starr and George Carlin really did an amazing job narrating this episode in style. What else can I say? Awesome crash, stunning visuals, amazing music. This is my overall favorite Henry episode. Number 7. All at Sea. Most people love Escape as their favorite Season 3 episode, or even Henry's Forest, and while I love both episodes, this is my absolute favorite from this season, and for very good reasons. As my friend Usual Bloke Luke stated in his analysis review on the episode, it teaches us as an audience, both as kids and young adults, about the true value of home. Duck wishes to explore what's beyond the horizon out at sea, but he couldn't because he is an engine stuck to his rails, and it started to affect his work, much to Percy's annoyance. This is a common mindset that we all have as people. We have a desire to travel to other countries or places far away, but even then we all face setbacks on why we can't, either because of mental health reasons or we couldn't afford any profit to go the distance, and as a result, we start to question what our true purpose really means to us. It was only after an emergency arises when Duck took an injured sailor to hospital by rail when Harold was busy, and especially after Bertie's little compliment does it finally click with Doug that even though he couldn't travel to foreign places, he realizes what his true purpose is as an engine, including his friends. That is handled brilliantly in a way that's never blatantly said. Take notes, Bubba, take notes. Speaking of Duck, I really love what Season 3 did with him. When he was first introduced, he was always the no-nonsense city-like guy who's very proud of his Great Western heritage. It was only this episode that fleshed him out more as a character, which is his love for the sea, and this could have been made as a prequel to Donald's Duck, to which later he gets his own branch line that runs along the coast because of said passion, especially since the real-life Great Western Railway goes to holiday seaside resorts. The harbor scenes are also spot on, including the regatta. As a kid, every single shot of Thomas always looked and felt real, and rightfully so because it really is. It's where you can escape to this kind of world and feel free. Even the music is tear-jerking too, including that one played at the very last shot, which I always get happy goosebumps watching that very scene. This is by far my overall favorite Duck episode of the entire show. I may like Slip Coaches, but that comes in second place. It was also the final episode on both Percy's Ghostly Trick and 10 Years of Thomas releases, so it really was a fitting conclusion to a bunch of astounding episodes. Number 6. Old Iron. Ah yes, everyone and their grandma fondly remembers this one. An old engine rescuing a runaway red engine down the main line with no driver or fireman on board. This is one of the few episodes that comes to everyone's mind when they think about Series 2. While most love Edward's exploit, and I do too, but Old Iron is more worthy of praise for being my favorite Edward episode. For one, this was seen on several different VHS and DVD releases, and second is the tension and action, especially for how it handled the consequences of runaway trains. They are a very serious matter in real life and can often lead to disastrous results, and this episode really shows. When some naughty boys fiddle with James's controls, there is a great deal of panic and race against time to stop him, including the signalman stopping all traffic to prevent any accidents, to the intense runaway scene where James realizes what is happening and that he couldn't stop. That is what makes Thomas so realistic than any other sentient vehicle show, the connection between engine and human. While the engines are the main focus, the core concept of having that human connection and touch be associated with them is what makes it even more impactful. The engines don't manage a railway themselves, so they rely on their drivers and firemen to start and stop them, and without them being on board, they get frightened when they can't stop themselves. Amtrak Guide 365 made an analysis video about Thomas and runaway trains if you hadn't seen it. The only way to catch James is Edward, who was getting on in years by this point as part of his character arc in the earlier stories, but even at his old age, he still gave it his all to hurl after James with the help of an inspector carrying a rope and pole, especially since this story is based on a real-life runaway in the USA where an engine had to be rescued by a lasso. Speaking of Edward, I really love how he doesn't give a shit about James's remark at the beginning and instead brushes it off, knowing that he and the other engines will soon learn to respect him eventually, something that the hidden CGI seasons failed to do so as a character. As for the runaway, those are some of the best shots ever directed by David Mitton, including that scene of James and Edward racing under a bridge. It really shows how much fun they had with the periscope camera lens on a small set, or as a certain newscast talking about Shining Time Station would say, technical wizardry. Even the music intensified the scene well, and narration from both Ringo and George. What else there to say? Another iconic, legendary episode featuring our favorite old blue engine. Number 5. Tit for Tat. I was originally going to have that, Mike's Whistling Useful Railway as all tied on this very spot. However, when writing the script, I rewatched all three back to back and ultimately, I love Tit for Tat more than the other two. Yeah, I know, opinions change. That's not to say the other two are bad, they are still fairly good adaptations, though I prefer the way their original storylines are told in the Railway series. But moving on to the episode, I remember when I was looking on the Wiki in 2017 to see if there are any new episodes coming soon, and when I found out that they are going to be adapting the small railway engine stories onto the screen, I literally flipped in excitement. This is the first time since Series 4's Mind That Bike to have an episode based on a railway series story. Then, after I saw it, I loved it, and I still think it's a brilliant adaptation. It stayed true to the original source of material, and I do like how they made a few creative liberties to make it more interesting. No, not because of the runtime, but most notably the ending scene. In the original, Bert only mentioned the events to Rex and Mike after what happened to him earlier, but here, It actually shows the scene where Bert and the clergyman each apologized to each other and both men made amends in cleaning him. Speaking of the clergyman, in this case Bo Wilbert, Audrey, and Teddy Boston, it's really nice to see them speak and appear in the show just like how they were in the books in real life. Though I will say though, Audrey's voice by Rob Rackstraw is nailed accurately to what he truly sounded like. Even his render looks a lot more realistic. Though I think Nigel Plaskett, I hope I didn't butcher that wrong, does sound more natural from that narrated forward on PBS. Besides Bert, their interactions with other characters like Thomas is pretty funny to watch, which is clearly obvious it's meant to be a reference to Audrey's opinion on Season 3 Thomas. It really feels like Thomas finally met his own creator. I also love the rendition of Never Overlook a Little Engine, the gorgeous animation, the humor, and especially Bert as a character, given how he is my favorite Arlesdale engine because his story is also my favorite in small railway engines as well as fan content. I especially love that bit of him not understanding the difference of books and media, given how he's an older but naive engine, of course. I'll always love the classic model series, but CGI, while it may just exist, is also good in its own right. Flawed, yes, but it's not terrible either, when you just cut straight to the Brenner era, of course. This is certainly my favorite episode from this era of the show, and Tit for Tat is such an iconic episode of references galore. Number 4. Duncan's Bluff. This is an episode I don't usually see everyone talk about during the 2000s and 2010s until now, where it's finally given some more love. This is also one of the first few newer episodes of seasons 10 and 11 that I saw during the early years of YouTube, and I immediately have it stuck in my mind to this very day. First off is the rivalry between Duncan and James, two hot-headed characters with different traits clashing together in a room, and fierce competition ensues. Whether this is intentional or not, I feel that this is a brilliant sequel to Rock and Roll, where James badly influenced Duncan about how to deal with Rusty. That is by far the only time until this episode that we ever see these two interact. It's kind of fun to see how the narrow gauge engines bounce off their big engine counterparts, like Peter, Sam, and Henry in Refreshment Lady, and Sir Handel and Gordon on a few occasions. I believe since they made that large-scale model of James for the wharf sets that they finally came up with this episode, but that could just be me. Back to the characters in this episode, I must say this really paid off really well, where they had that little wager at the very start of the episode during their banter, especially when Duncan later hid all the coal trucks so that he could win. And it all came to a nice little closure when the latter came to James's rescue when he ran out of coal, and both put aside their differences and admit they are both really useful in their own ways, kind of like other characters putting their rivalries to rest, like Percy and Harold in Letters to Santa, or Gordon and Spencer in Confused Coaches. Also, while I don't usually watch the UK narration of the hit era due to Michael Angelis sounding very bored, but in the case of a few episodes like this one, this is actually one of the few times where his energy fits really well. And this is one of the few times where he is surprisingly really good, especially where he timed his narration perfectly. So this so happened to be one of my favorite narrated episodes by him, I must say. Michael Brandon does a great job too, but I don't think he timed his narration slightly in this episode. Overall, this is one of my favorite episodes of the entire hit era, as well as my favorite to come out from Season 10. Number 3. Toby and the Flood. This is the first episode on races, rescues, and runaways, and I like to believe this is the mascot episode of said release for many reasons. For one, the stormy atmosphere and music is what captured the visuals and story really damn perfectly. And second is the tension built up at the beginning with fear and worry, which isn't your typical standard lighthearted kind of vibe, especially with concerns of the dam not being able to hold enough water. What I love most about it is the scene where it eventually breaks and Toby getting swept away by the flood caused by it. Yeah, it may be unrealistic of him to stop in the middle of the bridge when the climax happened, but it can be easy to look past it and let the story flow. I'm sure the same could be said for Toby's tightrope, for he may not be able to hold on for that long. The narration provided by Alec Baldwin is also brilliant, especially in the scene where Toby shouted for help, which in my opinion is timed perfectly, something that Michael Angelis and other international dubs never did, and as a result was said way too early. As for the sets themselves, they all look even more real and lifelike, such as that village at the beginning and end, especially with all that rain, which is a lot more English weather-esque. And as for the characters themselves, I'd say this is the best usage of Toby and Percy's dynamic perfectly. The Unlucky Tug sums it up pretty well in his Sodor's Finest episode about Toby, which I highly recommend checking out. Percy looks up to Toby and the latter fathers him in a way, and they really love playing around with it in Season 5, which I think was kind of the last time we ever saw this dynamic before they started pushing more of the Thomas and Percy duo in later years, apart from Emily Knows Best, of course. And I like how Percy is very well characterized here, for he isn't that hesitant to rescue Toby from nearly falling to his death over the waterfall. This is the Percy we want to see grow up and mature, not the one in the later years where he is all panicky for many pathetic reasons. I like to think this is set up before Put Upon Percy, where he does eventually becomes the bravest of all engines. And as for Toby, he is also in perfect character here too, especially because even the wisest of characters are allowed to get scared when put in dangerous situations. I remember being so frightened of this episode as a kid, but with time I started to appreciate much more naturally, and this is overall one of my favorite Toby episodes out of the entire show that is a great rescue story and stunning visuals. Number 2. Grandpuff and Sleeping Beauty. Those two are my absolute favorite episodes of Series 4. In fact, they are both the standout episodes of that season for a lot of things. First off, these are the very first episodes to center around the fan-favorite narrow-gauge Skarloey engines. And second, they both set up the mood of what this season is all about. Escapism, atmosphere, sad, adventure and comfy tones, charming music, and stunning visuals. Like Rescue and Bad Day, those two I remember vaguely from the VHS it was featured on and never released on DVD until about several years later. Heck, I'm honestly shocked it was never given a reprint on VHS like those other Anchor-based styled releases. I also love how the crew set both episodes as the premiere ones to kickstart Season 4 rather than Four Little Engines, which actually makes the illusion more natural. For our main characters, Duke, Stewart, and Falcon, or as we know the latter as Peter, Sam, and Sir Handel, I love their relationship here, for underneath the teasing and banters, those three really make up a family together, and when they get split up when their railway closed, you really feel sad for them. But many years later, when they reunite when Duke was rediscovered, it gives some really happy goosebumps. Speaking of which, the last few scenes in Grandpuff really are some of the most saddest moments to ever come out of classic Thomas. It really did make me cry upon my Series 4 rewatch. Even the somber music and visuals make it even more bleak and depressing. But what I like most about Duke is that instead of feeling mopey or sad, despite being stuck in that shed under earth and not knowing what's going on, he still holds on to hope, and what does he do before he was eventually found? He just simply goes to sleep to help pass the time. Even that line, "Oh well," shows he's still optimistic inside through a difficult situation. These two are also my favorite episodes narrated by George Carlin. I especially love his Duke voice, for he makes him sound even more grandfatherly-ish. You know, kind of like Doc from Cars. Even Michael Angelis is great too, including his laugh for Smudger. Finally, the humor in both episodes are great, especially in Sleeping Beauty, where that one man just fell through the roof of Duke's shed, which is priceless. I can go on and on about it, but there's just so much to incorporate into this list. So to cap it all off, both are fantastic episodes that sum up a beautiful season and are 2 recommended episodes for any new Thomas fan who are just starting with the franchise, both the show and the Railway series books. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. My number 1 favorite Thomas episode of all time is... A Better View for Gordon. You all know me by this point, especially since Gordon is my absolute favorite Thomas character, and this is one of his grandest episodes ever written. I really love how he was very well characterized, believing he's the most finest engine on Sodor. It really feels reminiscent of the early Audrey stories where his dialogue is written in a more pompous way. But at the same time, he isn't at all perfect when it comes to certain flaws both in age and when his words come to bite him back in the buffers. The former part I just mentioned is because he is also growing older and starts to deal with problems in his next stage in life, which is also another beneficial factor in his arc in the Railway series, which is also slightly mentioned in a few more episodes in the model era. Grumpy Gordon, I will say, when portrayed well, is always funny and enjoyable to watch in a more genuine way, unlike the Brenner era, sadly, which keeps overdoing this. Back to the episode itself, though, this is the one where it introduces my favorite station in the series, Kirk Ronan, and going by design, looks like an actual station terminus, just like the real ones in the UK or US. Even the crash is brilliant too, which of course is directly based on a real-life accident at Guermont-Pernaz in 1895. Even from watching those rush tapes of Season 5 where they had to redo this crash 3 times really shows how much passion the modeling crew put into for making such a brutal and excellent scene. Gosh, I can't imagine that 4 interchangeable walls would be enough for different takes. Also, this is one of the few times where a human is physically injured and not just the engines, which does contradict the generic "luckily no one is hurt" that is always prominent in the show. As for the characters, I really enjoyed that little banter of Gordon, James, and Percy at the beginning, and when the former complains about the station wall, which feels very Audrey-esque. Yeah, I know I keep saying this, but hey. Narration-wise, Alec Baldwin really nails this one brilliantly. Yes, this is going to be a controversial opinion, but I'm one of those people who even enjoys his Gordon voice, at least in this season. It makes the whole experience of watching it even more great, though Michael Angelis also does a great job too in the UK dub, for a few line deliveries at least. I remember watching this many times on my Cranky Bugs and Best of Gordon releases. Admittedly, I did get a little scared by Gordon's line after he smashed through the wall, but as I got older, now I find it pretty hilarious. I even had that Random House book of the same title along with Flood and Busy Going Backwards from some years ago, which I'm still proud of having it to this day. It has always been my favorite episode as a kid, and I still love it to this very day. It could even fit within the context of the Railway series. Whenever I think about Gordon as a character, or going to station terminuses, or even see some crafted paper versions of Smashed Walls, I would think of this episode. Even from when I think about the show, A Better View for Gordon comes to my mind as an episode. It is such an iconic story that I will never get tired of, and will always be very special to me as a Thomas fan for more years to come in my heart. Phew! That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed me rambling on what my favorite episodes were, and happy 40th anniversary to our favorite television show of all time. Be sure to comment, like, and tell me what your top 20 favorite Thomas episodes are. I'm really keen to know.